Brandon reached across the front desk and slid their room request form back across the counter. Not handed it back, slid it. The way you slide a plate away from something you don't want to touch. "Sir, ma'am." He said it the way people say words they don't mean. "I'm going to be straight with you. This is the Caldwell Grand. We have a certain kind of guest we accommodate here, and I think I say this respectfully, that two black folks who just walked in off the street in wet coats looking for a room at 9 p.m. during a storm." He tilted his head. "This probably isn't your kind of place. There's a motel out on Route 9. More your speed." He smiled when he said it. Joe said nothing. He set his umbrella against the counter. Quietly. Carefully. Brandon leaned forward, lowered his voice just enough to make it feel like a secret between them. "Look, I don't want to make this uncomfortable, but people are watching. And having you two standing here, it sends a message we can't afford to send. You understand what I mean, don't you?" Ruth straightened. She looked at him with the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of surviving moments exactly like this one. Brandon glanced at the security guard near the door, then back at Joe. His voice dropped one more register. "Sir, I'm going to say this once more nicely. Go back out that door. Get in your car. Drive to Route 9. Because if I have to ask you again, it won't be me doing the asking." He tapped the desk twice with 2 fingers, like a period at the end of a sentence, like the matter was already settled. Joe reached into his coat pocket, placed something on the desk between them. Brandon looked down, looked up. The smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. He didn't know yet what he was looking at, but he was about to find out. And before this night was over, the mayor of Harlan Falls would be standing in this lobby looking for the man he'd just threatened, and every carefully constructed wall Brandon Mercer had ever built around this place would come down in a single hour. Don't go anywhere. This story is one you need to stay for every part of it. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Right now, I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. And if you believe dignity doesn't have a dress code, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon. It started the way bad things often start in Tennessee, quietly, with a sky that turned the wrong shade of yellow somewhere around 3 o'clock, and a wind that picked up just enough to make the trees along the highway lean in one direction and stay there. By 6, the radio was issuing flood warnings for 4 counties. By 7:30, the rain was coming down so hard it turned headlights into smears of white light and made the road ahead look like something seen through frosted glass. Joe Caldwell kept both hands on the wheel. He drove the way he did most things, steadily, without drama, reading what was in front of him and adjusting before it became a problem. Ruth sat in the passenger seat, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she always wore them when she wasn't reading, but might need to soon. The radio cycled through emergency alerts. She turned the volume down 1 notch, not off, just enough to make room for thinking. They had left Atlanta that morning. Their granddaughter Imani was graduating from Tennessee State University the following afternoon, the first in her generation of the family to finish a 4-year degree. Ruth had pressed Joe's good blazer 3 times that morning. Joe had pretended not to notice. They had been married 43 years, and in that time Ruth had pressed his blazer before every important occasion. He had learned that pointing it out only led to a conversation about whether he understood what important meant. He understood. The drive had been fine until Cookeville, where the highway began to flood in patches, and the GPS rerouted them twice in 30 minutes. By the time they reached the outskirts of Harlan Falls, the detour had added 90 minutes to the trip, and the fuel gauge was sitting 1 notch below a quarter tank. Joe took the exit. Harlan Falls was the kind of Tennessee town that had reinvented itself twice, once after the textile mills closed in the 80s, and again after a downtown revitalization project in the early 2000s, brought in restaurants and boutique shops and a riverwalk that flooded every spring, but looked beautiful the other 10 months of the year. Main Street still had its original brick buildings. Most of them restored their facades lit warmly against the dark October sky. The Caldwell Grand sat at the corner of Main and 2nd, exactly where it had always sat. Joe saw the sign from half a block away. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something that carries more history than it appears to. The lettering was different from what he remembered. Newer font backlit now instead of painted. But the name was the same. It was always the same. Ruth turned her head and looked at him. Joe, I see it. You want to find somewhere else? He was quiet for 3 seconds. The windshield wipers moved back and forth. The rain hammered the roof of the car. No, he said. It's the closest, and there's a flood warning. What Joe Caldwell did not say, what he had not said to anyone in a very long time, was that this building had lived in him the way certain places live in certain people. Not as a memory exactly. More like a weight that you carry so long you stop noticing it until something makes you shift it from one shoulder to the other. His grandfather, James Caldwell, had worked in that building for 22 years. Not as a guest, not as a manager, as a porter. He carried bags, polished brass held elevator doors, and smiled at people who sometimes did not smile back. He entered through the service door on 2nd Street every morning at 5:45 and left through the same door every evening. In 22 years, he never once walked through the front entrance. It was not his door. That was simply how things were. Joe had heard the story so many times growing up that it had become less a story and more a landscape, something he moved through rather than listened to. His grandfather told it without bitterness. That was the part that had stayed with Joe longest. The absence of bitterness. Not because James Caldwell didn't feel it, but because he had made a decision somewhere along the way that bitterness was a tax he refused to keep paying on someone else's debt. Joe had bought the building in 1987. He was 30 years old running a property company out of a 2-room office in Nashville with 1 employee and a second-hand fax machine. The purchase had stretched him past the point of comfort and into the territory where you either grow into the decision or it swallows you. He had grown into it. Held it for 7 years, invested in the restoration, brought it back from near dereliction. Sold it in 1994 to a hospitality group that wanted to expand into smaller markets. The sale agreement had included a clause, his attorney's idea, which Joe had approved without much deliberation at the time, tied to historic preservation obligations. He had not thought about that clause in years. He thought about it now. They parked in the small lot beside the building. The rain was coming sideways. Joe held his umbrella over Ruth as they crossed the lot, which meant he arrived at the front entrance with his left shoulder completely soaked. He didn't mention it. Ruth noticed and didn't mention it either. That was the architecture of a long marriage, knowing which things to leave in the rain. The lobby was warm and amber lit, all dark wood panels and brass fixtures and the faint smell of cedar and old carpet. A jazz standard played softly from somewhere. The storm outside made the inside feel more inside than usual. Joe held the door for Ruth. She walked through. He followed. Behind the front desk, Brandon Mercer looked up, and the smile he had ready, the professional, rehearsed customer service smile arrived on his face, took one full look at the 2 people walking toward him, and began its retreat. "Good evening." Joe set his umbrella in the stand beside the desk. "We'd like a room for the night. 1 night, possibly 2, depending on the weather." Brandon's eyes had already done their work. They had traveled quickly, practiced from Joe's rain-soaked canvas jacket to Ruth's simple floral blouse to the battered umbrella now dripping quietly onto the marble floor. The assessment took less than 2 seconds. It always did. I'm sorry. Brandon's voice carried the smooth, frictionless tone of someone who had rehearsed regret until it felt like courtesy. We're fully booked this evening. I wouldn't be able to help you. Behind him, the reservation screen glowed on the monitor, angled just slightly away from guest view. Destiny Hooks, 24 years old and 7 months into this job, stood 3 feet to Brandon's left, restocking keycard sleeves. She could see the screen clearly. 14 rooms available, 3 junior suites, a corner king on the 4th floor that had been sitting empty for 4 days. She kept her eyes down and restocked the keycard sleeves. Joe nodded slowly. Is that right? Any availability tomorrow? I'm afraid the system is showing limited inventory across the coming days. There's been quite a surge with the storm. Brandon placed both palms flat on the desk, a gesture that managed to be simultaneously polite and immovable. There's a motel on Route 9 about 12 miles east. They typically have availability, might be more suitable for your needs. 12 miles east, in a flood warning, in a car with a quarter tank of gas. Ruth heard the 12 miles the way she heard most things, completely, all the way through to what it meant. She didn't react. She had a gift for receiving bad information without letting it move her face. We've been driving for several hours, she said. We'd be happy with whatever you have available. A standard room is fine. Brandon's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The tel was small enough that most people would miss it. Joe didn't miss it. 43 years in boardrooms and negotiating tables had taught him to read the muscle before the mouth, and what Brandon's jaw said right now was that this conversation was supposed to be over, and the fact that it wasn't was a problem. Ma'am, as I said, the front door opened behind them. A man walked in from the rain. White mid-50s tailored charcoal suit, a rolling carry-on bag with a designer tag, no umbrella, apparently unbothered by the fact that his collar was damp. He had the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. He didn't glance at Joe or Ruth. He walked directly to the desk. Evening. Mercer Wright, I called ahead. Whitmore Regional Sales. Brandon's entire body changed. The tension in his shoulders released. His chin lifted. The professional smile, the real one, warm and wide, arrived without effort and looked nothing like the one he had offered Joe and Ruth. Mr. Whitmore, of course. Brandon was already reaching for the keyboard. We actually have our corner suite available on the 4th floor, just opened up this afternoon. I'd like to offer you the upgrade at no additional charge. Welcome to the Caldwell Grand. He printed the keycard. He slid it across the counter with both hands. Joe watched the whole exchange without turning his head. He didn't need to turn his head. He could see it in the way the ambient sound of the lobby changed, a slight shift, like a room that had been holding its breath, releasing it. The bellhop, a young man of perhaps 20, with sandy hair and the slightly haunted expression of someone working a double shift, came forward to take Mr. Whitmore's bag. He rolled it toward the elevator, passing directly in front of Joe and Ruth. For one moment, one full second, he looked Joe directly in the eyes. Then he turned his face away, not out of malice, out of something worse. Out of the practiced self-preserving blindness of a person who has learned that seeing certain things costs more than not seeing them. He looked away the way you look away from a car accident on the other side of a highway, aware of it, troubled by it, already moving past it. Joe felt that look leave and arrive in the same instant. It settled somewhere in his chest. Ruth touched his arm, light as a feather. He covered her hand with his. Brandon turned back to them. His expression had reset, smooth, impassive, the customer service mask reinstalled. As I was saying, we really aren't able to accommodate you this evening. We'll wait, Joe said, in case something opens up. Brandon blinked. That was not the expected response. The expected response was resignation, a nod, the slow turn toward the door. It was always the door. The whole architecture of this kind of refusal depended on the door, on the polite implication being strong enough that people removed themselves before it became explicit. "It could be quite a long wait," Brandon said. "That's fine." Joe placed his hand on the small of Ruth's back and guided her toward the two chairs near the window beside the fireplace. They sat down. Ruth crossed her ankles. Joe folded his coat over the arm of the chair. The storm pressed against the lobby windows. Brandon stared at them from behind the desk. Then he reached under the counter, picked up the house phone, and dialed an extension. His voice dropped too low to hear clearly, but the words, situation, and won't leave carried across the lobby. Destiny finished restocking the keycard sleeves. She kept her eyes forward and her face completely still, the way you keep still when you're standing very close to something dangerous and hoping it doesn't notice you. The chairs by the fireplace were comfortable. That was the first thing Joe noticed, genuinely comfortable, the kind of chair that had been chosen by someone who understood that hospitality was a physical experience before it was anything else. The leather was worn at the armrests in a way that suggested years of use. He appreciated that. He had always appreciated things that showed their history honestly. The fire was gas, not wood, but it threw real heat, and after 90 minutes in a car with rain hammering the roof and a heater that took 20 minutes to warm up the heat, was something close to mercy. Ruth settled into her chair and opened her handbag. She took out a small, leather-bound notebook, dark green, the spine cracked from years of opening. She clicked her pen and wrote something at the top of a new page. Joe didn't ask what. He already knew. She had been keeping the notebook for 22 years. It had started after an incident at a car dealership in Memphis in 2001, when a salesman had followed them through the lot for 40 minutes before finally asking with visible reluctance if he could help them. Ruth had come home that night and written it down. Not in anger. In the same precise, measured hand she had used for 26 years, writing lesson plans and legal briefs. Date. Location. What was said. What was not said. What happened next. 83 entries. She turned to entry 84 and began to write. Across the lobby, Brandon stood behind the front desk, trying to look like a man who hadn't just made a phone call he regretted. He was not succeeding. Every 30 seconds, his eyes moved to the chairs by the fireplace, and every time they found Joe and Ruth still there, something in his expression recalibrated irritation, sharpening into something closer to unease. They were supposed to be gone. The whole system depended on people leaving. Staying was not part of the system. At 6 minutes past 9, he picked up the house phone again. This time, he didn't lower his voice. "Yeah, it's Brandon at the front desk. I've got an elderly black couple refusing to leave the lobby. I've tried everything short of physically removing them." A pause. He turned slightly away from the desk, but not far enough. "What's your call?" The lobby held very still. Ruth's pen stopped moving. She did not look up. She did not turn toward the desk. She simply stopped writing for exactly 4 seconds, then continued. Her handwriting did not change. Joe looked at the fire. 3 seconds of silence came through Brandon's phone. Then a voice, flat, unhurried, careful in the way that people are careful when they want to be helpful without being accountable, said 2 words. "Use your judgment." Brandon hung up. He straightened his jacket. He nodded once to himself, as if he'd received something he could use. Ruth wrote the words, "Use your judgment," in her notebook. Underlined them once. Destiny had been rearranging a display of tourist brochures near the end of the desk for the past 4 minutes. She had rearranged it 3 times. She was not looking at the brochures. She was listening with the full concentration of someone who understood that what she was hearing was important, and that pretending not to hear it was a choice she would have to live with. She put the brochures down, walked to the small service station behind the desk, poured 2 cups of coffee from the carafe, real coffee, not the decaf they put out after 8, placed them on a small tray, walked out from behind the desk. She crossed the lobby without looking at Brandon. She could feel his eyes on her back the whole way. She set the tray on the small table beside the fireplace chairs and straightened up. "On the house," she said. Her voice was quiet, steadier than she expected it to be. Ruth looked up from the notebook. She looked at Destiny the way a person looks at another person when they want to actually see them. "Thank you, sweetheart." Destiny opened her mouth. Something that started as an apology began to form. Joe shook his head gently. "You have nothing to answer for." Destiny nodded, swallowed, walked back to the desk. Brandon watched her return. He said nothing. But he made a note the way small men make notes in the part of his mind reserved for things that would be addressed later when the immediate situation was resolved and the power balance had been restored. Joe picked up the coffee cup. It was good coffee. He drank it slowly. "Remember the hotel in Charlotte?" Ruth said. She wasn't asking. She was remembering out loud. "The one that lost our reservation. The one that found it again very quickly after you mentioned you owned 3 buildings on their block." Joe smiled. It came from somewhere deep and took its time reaching his face. "They comped the room. And the breakfast. The breakfast was terrible." Ruth laughed. It was a soft laugh, private, the kind that belongs to 2 people who have been through enough together that certain memories become a language only they speak. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the windows. The jazz standard on the lobby speakers moved into something slower, something in a minor key. Near the lobby bar, a man named Dale Whitfield set down his bourbon glass. He was 61, built like someone who had played football in college and kept most of it with silver at his temples and the permanently slightly sunburned complexion of a man who spent too much time at outdoor real estate sites. He had been watching the couple by the fireplace for the past 10 minutes, with the focused attention of someone trying to place a face they knew they recognized. He picked up his phone, opened a browser, typed a name he wasn't quite sure about yet. Across the lobby, the front door opened. A woman in a rain-soaked coat stepped inside, shaking water from her umbrella, a reporter's notebook tucked under her arm. Iris Chen had come in for a late dinner. She had not expected a story, but she recognized one immediately. Brandon came out from behind the desk at 9:17. He walked across the lobby with the measured stride of a man who had decided that the situation had gone on long enough and that he was the one who was going to end it. The security guard, a broad man named Curtis, who had worked the night shift at the Caldwell Grand for 3 years and had learned to read Brandon's moods the way sailors read. Weather fell into step 2 paces behind him without being asked. Joe saw them coming. He didn't move. Brandon stopped in front of the fireplace chairs. He clasped his hands in front of him, a gesture that was designed to look patient, but communicated the opposite. He looked at Joe, then at Ruth, then back at Joe. "Sir." His voice was low, controlled, the kind of controlled that takes practice. "I want to handle this respectfully. But you've been sitting here for nearly 40 minutes, and I have other guests to attend to. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Joe looked up at him. "On what grounds? You are not registered guests. This is private property. We're attempting to become registered guests. You told us you had no rooms. We're waiting in case availability changes." Brandon's jaw tightened. "It won't. Then we'll confirm that when it doesn't." Joe picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, Set it back down. We're not bothering anyone. Brandon leaned forward slightly. When he spoke again, his voice dropped one full register, quiet enough that it didn't carry past the three of them loud enough to make its weight felt. Sir, I'm going to say this plainly. This isn't the kind of place for people like you. I think you understand what I mean. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you knew that when you walked in. He paused. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to save us all an uncomfortable evening. So please, take your wife, go back out that door, drive to Route 9. The lobby breathed. Ruth set her pen down on the open page of her notebook. She looked at Brandon with an expression that had no anger in it whatsoever. That was the thing about Ruth Caldwell. She had been a civil rights attorney for 19 years. And in that time she had learned that anger, however justified, hands the other person something to push against. What she gave Brandon instead was clarity, clear, level, undeflectable. Not the kind of place for people like us, she repeated. Slowly. The way you repeat something to make sure everyone in earshot has heard it correctly. I want to make sure I understand you. Brandon straightened. He had not expected the repetition. Repetition was dangerous. Repetition made things real in a way that implication carefully avoided. Ma'am, you've said what you came to say. Joe stood up. He was taller than Brandon had registered from behind the desk. Not dramatically so, perhaps an inch taller, maybe two, but in this moment the difference felt architectural. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to rooms like this one. I heard you, Joe said. Every word. Brandon held his ground, but only technically. His body had already made a small, involuntary adjustment, a fraction of a step backward, barely perceptible. Curtis behind him had gone very still. Then a woman's voice came from near the fireplace, from a love seat 8 feet away, that Joe had not registered as occupied. Excuse me. She was mid-50s, well-dressed, a glass of red wine in one hand, and a cashmere wrap around her shoulders. She had the comfortable, unhurried look of a regular guest, someone for whom this lobby was familiar territory. She stood up and walked toward Ruth with the expression of a woman about to offer solidarity. Ruth looked at her. Something opened slightly in her face. After this evening, after everything, the approach of another woman felt like it might be something. The woman leaned down slightly. Her voice was gentle, almost conspiratorial. Honey, she said, maybe it's just easier if you find somewhere else tonight. You don't want this kind of trouble. She patted Ruth's hand once lightly. Some battles just aren't worth it, you know. Then she straightened, adjusted her cashmere wrap, picked up her wine glass and walked back to her love seat. Sat down, crossed her legs, took a sip. Ruth watched her go. She didn't move for a moment. She just watched. And then she looked down at her notebook, at the open page, at the 84th entry, and something in her expression settled into a weariness that had nothing to do with the hour, or the drive, or the storm outside. It was the specific weariness that comes not from enemies, but from people who mean well and cause harm anyway. From the ones who look at injustice and see an inconvenience. From the ones who counsel survival when what is needed is witness. Joe placed his hand on her shoulder. She covered it with hers. I know, he said quietly. She picked up her pen, wrote 3 more lines, closed the notebook. Across the lobby, Iris Chen stood near the entrance to the restaurant. Her own notebook open, her pen moving steadily. She had arrived for a late dinner and a quiet hour. She had found something else entirely. She was writing the way journalists write when they understand that what is in front of them is not a story they will pitch tomorrow. It is a story that is writing itself right now, and their only job is to keep up. Dale Whitfield had gone back to his phone. His search results had populated. He was reading with the focused intensity of a man who has just realized he was wrong about something important. He set his phone face down on the bar, picked up his bourbon, set it back down without drinking. Then he stood up. Dale Whitfield crossed the lobby with the unhurried stride of a man who had spent 4 decades in real estate and understood that the most important moves were always the quiet ones. He stopped in front of Joe, extended his hand. "Dale Whitfield," he said. "Loud enough. Not performing, just loud enough. Whitfield Development, Nashville. I believe we met at the Infrastructure Summit in Knoxville, 2019. Joe looked at him for a moment, then shook his hand. "I remember." Dale nodded. He didn't say anything else immediately. He just stood there beside Joe, facing the lobby, which was its own kind of statement. The geometry of it changed something. 2 men standing together in a space where one man had just been told he didn't belong. Brandon, watching from the desk, recalibrated visibly. Dale Whitfield was a known quantity. Old money, new developments. The kind of name that appeared on building permits and charity galas and the shortlist for the Chamber of Commerce Board. His presence beside Joe introduced a variable Brandon hadn't accounted for. At table 4, near the restaurant entrance, Iris Chen's pen stopped moving. She looked up. She had been a journalist for 19 years. She had covered City Hall, 3 gubernatorial campaigns, a federal corruption trial, and the kind of local stories that never made national news, but mattered to the people who lived inside them. She knew the moment a story changed shape. This was that moment. She picked up her phone, opened a search browser, typed the name she had heard Dale say. Joseph Caldwell, Caldwell Property Group. The results loaded. She read the first 3 lines of the Wikipedia entry, set her phone face down on the table, picked it up again, read further. Her expression did not change. That was the training, the 19 years, but her hand, the one holding the pen, went very still. 4 feet away, a couple in their 40s, who had been working through a bottle of Bordeaux and a shared cheese plate, had stopped talking. The woman had her own phone out. She showed the screen to her husband. He read it. His eyebrows moved. He read it again. The information moved through the lobby, the way heat moves through metal, not dramatically, not in a wave, but steadily, contact by contact, until everything it touched was changed. A man at the bar leaned over to show his companion something on his screen. The companion covered her mouth. A couple near the piano exchanged a look that needed no words. Phones came out. Not to record, not yet, but to confirm. People needed to see the face and match it to the man by the fireplace. The face was not difficult to find. There were 14 results on the first page alone. Forbes Profile 2021. Bloomberg Interview 2022. Nashville Business Journal Cover 2023. A profile in the Tennessean from 3 years ago, with a photograph of Joe standing in front of a building in downtown Nashville, younger-looking, mid-60s, the same quiet expression he wore now. Caldwell Property Group, founder and CEO. Net worth estimated at $2.8 billion. 3 decades of commercial real estate development across 12 states. And then the detail that moved through the room like a current finding ground. A photograph. Black and white, slightly grainy, clearly scanned from a print original. A young man 30 years old at most, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, the jacket slightly too wide in the shoulders, the tie slightly too short, standing in front of a building on a street corner. He was holding a key, smiling. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Joseph Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Property Group, following the acquisition of the Caldwell Grand Hotel property in Harlan Falls, Tennessee, 1987. Photo courtesy, Harlan Falls Courier." The woman at table 4 zoomed in on the photograph, looked up at the man by the fireplace, looked back at the photograph. The building in the photograph was this building. The key in the young man's hand was this building's key. The sign above the door in the photograph, partially visible, slightly blurred, read the Caldwell Grand in lettering that had since been updated, but was otherwise unchanged. What nobody in the lobby knew yet, what would emerge only later after Iris Chen started making calls, was that the photograph existed not only on the internet, it existed on the wall of this building. On the second floor in the hallway leading to the East Wing, there was a series of framed historical photographs documenting the property's history. Renovation milestones, architectural changes, a 1943 image of the original lobby, a 1967 photograph of the grand ballroom during a formal event. And at the end of the row, slightly apart from the others, a photograph from 1987, a young man in an ill-fitting suit holding a key standing in front of the building that bore his family's name. Brandon Mercer had walked past that photograph every working day for 4 years. He walked past it on his way to the staff meeting room. He walked past it when he checked the East Wing housekeeping schedule. He had never stopped to look at it carefully. Why would he? It was a historical photograph. It was furniture on a wall. The man in that photograph was currently sitting in one of his lobby chairs drinking coffee that his junior associate had brought over without authorization after Brandon had told him twice to leave. Destiny figured it out first among the desk staff. She was looking at the search results on her own phone held low behind the desk. She had typed the name 30 seconds after Dale Whitfield said it. She had read the same results as everyone else. But she had also looked at the availability screen, the screen that still showed 14 open rooms, and then back at her phone, and then at Joe by the fireplace. And the full weight of the evening assembled itself inside her chest all at once. Her hand went to her mouth. She looked at Brandon. He was still watching the lobby with the expression of a man managing a situation he believed was under control. He hadn't searched the name yet. He was about to. The front doors opened at 9:41. Mayor Patricia Okafor came in from the rain. The way she did most things directly, without preliminary, her presence filling the space before she had fully entered it. She was 52 years old, the first female mayor of Harlan Falls, and she had the particular bearing of a person who had spent years in rooms where people expected her not to be there and had long since stopped finding that interesting. Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. Her aide, a young man named Marcus, was 2 steps behind her with an umbrella that had clearly lost the argument with the storm. She stopped just inside the entrance. Her eyes moved across the lobby with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a career reading rooms. She found Joe in 4 seconds. Joe. The word came out like relief. She crossed the lobby with purpose, rain still dripping from her coat, and took both of his hands when she reached him. I have been calling you for 2 hours. The signal out on the highway. Patricia. Joe's expression warmed in a way it hadn't all evening. We're fine. Ruth is here. Ruth stood. Patricia embraced her. The roads are closed past mile marker 40. I was afraid you'd tried to push through. She pulled back, looked at both of them. Why are you sitting in the lobby? Did they not? She stopped. Read their faces. Read the lobby. Read the distance between the fireplace chairs and the front desk. The reading took her about 3 seconds. She turned and looked at Brandon Mercer. Brandon was already looking at her. He had gone the color of old paper. He had made the connection 40 seconds ago. He had finally Googled the name. Dale Whitfield had said it clearly enough, and something about the way the lobby had changed in the past 10 minutes had finally triggered the alarm that should have triggered an hour ago. He had typed Joseph Caldwell Harlan Falls into his phone browser, and the first result had loaded, and he had read it, and then he had looked up at the man by the fireplace, and then he had looked back at his phone, and then the front doors had opened, and the mayor of Harlan Falls had walked in, calling that man by his first name. Brandon's hand was shaking. Not dramatically, just enough that the phone he was still holding tapped lightly against the desk, a small rhythmic sound, almost like a clock. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way an official looks at something that needs to be addressed, and then addressed again, and then documented. Then she turned back to Joe. "Tell me what happened," Joe told her. He didn't editorialize. He didn't raise his voice. He laid it out with the same precision he brought to everything. The arrival, the refusal, the redirect to Route 9 in a flood. Warning the businessman upgraded to a suite, the bellhop who turned his face away, the phone call he had partially overheard the security guard, the woman with the cashmere wrap, the 2 words that had come through a phone and functioned as permission. "Use your judgment." Patricia listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change. That was the thing about Patricia Okafor. She had learned in 12 years of public life that the most powerful thing you could do when someone was telling you about an injustice was to receive it completely. No reassurances, no rush toward resolution. Just full, present, unambiguous witness. When Joe finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she stood, turned to face the front desk, and walked toward it. Brandon straightened. His mouth opened. The apology that had been assembling itself in his mind for the past 40 seconds began its approach. "Mr. Thompson. Mr. Caldwell. I want to say that there has clearly been a terrible—" "Brandon." Patricia's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Stop." He stopped. She placed both hands on the desk. She looked at him with the level, undeflectable attention of a woman who had sat across from harder men than this in much smaller rooms. This man and his wife drove through a flood warning and asked for a room. You turned them away. You redirected them to a motel 12 miles out on a road that has been under a flood advisory since 7 p.m. You told them this wasn't their kind of place. She paused. Is any part of what I just said inaccurate? Brandon's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Joe had followed her to the desk. He stood beside Patricia and he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. The old rain-soaked jacket that Brandon had assessed and dismissed in under 2 seconds, and he placed a folded document on the desk between them. Brandon looked at it. It was a property deed. The paper was aged at the folds, the ink slightly faded in the way that documents from the mid-'80s faded, but the text was clear. The date was March 14, 1987. The property address was 201 Main Street, Harlan Falls, Tennessee. The buyer's name, typed in the clean, administrative font of a title company document, was Joseph Allen Caldwell. My grandfather worked in this building for 22 years, Joe said. His voice was quiet, perfectly level. He came in through the service door on 2nd Street every morning. He was never permitted to use the front entrance. In 22 years, he never once walked through that door. Joe looked at Brandon. I bought this building the year he died. I sold it in 1994. The name stayed because the sale agreement required it. My family's name has been above that door for 32 years. The lobby had gone completely silent. Not the polite ambient quiet of people lowering their voices. The full pressed-down silence of a room in which everyone understands that something is happening that they will remember. The jazz standard on the speakers had ended and not resumed. Somewhere near the restaurant entrance, a fork touched a plate and the sound carried across the entire room. Iris Chen was writing without looking at her notebook. Destiny had both hands flat on the desk, as if she needed to confirm the surface was solid. Brandon's phone slipped from his fingers and landed face up on the desk. The screen was still open to the search results. The photograph from 1987, the young man in the ill-fitting suit holding a key standing in front of this building, looked up at the ceiling of the lobby. Brandon looked at the photograph, looked at Joe, looked at the photograph again. His legs appeared to make a decision his mind hadn't caught up with yet. They bent slightly at the knee, and he gripped the edge of the desk with both hands, and the ground beneath Brandon. Mercer shifted into something that would not hold him the way it had before. Brandon's apology arrived in pieces. It came the way poorly constructed things come apart, not all at once, but in stages, each stage revealing how little was holding it together in the first place. He started with misunderstanding, moved through our system, circled back to certainly didn't intend, and arrived finally at a version of sorry that had been so thoroughly processed by self-preservation that it no longer resembled the original emotion. Joe let him finish. He stood at the desk with his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders relaxed, and he let Brandon say every word of it. Not because it deserved to be heard, because allowing a man to complete his own insufficient apology is its own form of documentation. When Brandon stopped talking, Joe was quiet for 4 seconds. Which part was the misunderstanding, Brandon? Brandon blinked. The rooms, the availability there was it a misunderstanding when you told us you were fully booked? Joe's voice was unhurried. Each word placed with the deliberate care of someone who understands that what is said in the next 5 minutes will outlast this room, this evening, this storm. Or was it a misunderstanding when you seated a man with no reservation in the corner suite 30 seconds later? Or when you told my wife this wasn't her kind of place? He paused. Which part specifically was the misunderstanding? Brandon's mouth opened. The desk was the only thing that looked stable. Patricia Okafor stood 2 feet behind Joe's arms, folded her expression, the particular kind of granite that forms over years of watching powerful men discover consequences. Joe reached into his coat and took out Ruth's notebook. He didn't open it. He held it in one hand, its dark green cover facing outward, the cracked spine visible, the weight of 22 years of entries evident in the way it sat in his palm. My wife has been keeping this notebook since 2001, he said. 84 entries, hotels, restaurants, car dealerships, airport lounges, doctor's offices. He set it on the desk between them. She is a retired civil rights attorney. She is on the board of 2 Tennessee hospitals. She has argued before the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. And she has been keeping this notebook for 22 years because the alternative, pretending these moments don't happen, felt like a betrayal of every person they happened to who didn't have a notebook, who didn't have a name anyone would search, who just drove home in silence and sat in the driveway and couldn't go inside yet. The lobby held its breath. I don't need your apology, Joe continued. I want you to understand that clearly. I am not standing here for an apology. I am standing here because the people who got the same treatment we got tonight, the ones who didn't have Dale Whitfield recognizing their face, or the mayor of this city walking through the door those people left. They drove to Route 9, or they drove home, and they never got a word from you. Not a sorry, not an acknowledgement, not even the basic human recognition that what happened to them was wrong. He looked at Brandon without anger, with something more difficult than anger. Apologize to them, every single one. Start there. Brandon's lower lip moved. No sound came. Behind him, Destiny stood with her hands pressed flat on the desk. Her face was wet. She wasn't hiding it. She was one of the people Joe was talking about, not in this lobby, not tonight, but in 100 small rooms across a lifetime. She knew the notebook. She had kept her own version of it in her head because she'd never thought to write it down. Ruth had crossed the lobby and was standing beside Joe. She hadn't rushed. She had taken her time the way she did everything, and arrived at his side with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that her presence in this moment was its own complete statement. She looked at Brandon. Not with contempt, with the clear, exhausted, unflinching recognition of someone who has spent a lifetime being looked at, the way he had looked at her tonight, as a problem to be redirected, a disruption to an ecosystem built on her absence. 84 entries, she said softly, and I am so tired of writing them. The room did not recover from that sentence. It simply held it. Iris Chen had stopped pretending to be a bystander. She was standing near the fireplace, notebook, open pen moving. She was the kind of journalist who understood that the most important thing she could do right now was get it right, every word, every pause, every detail of who was standing where and what their faces did when the truth arrived. Dale Whitfield had not sat back down. He stood near the bar with his arms crossed and his bourbon untouched, and his expression was that of a man who had built things his whole life and was watching someone else's construction finally come down. The couple with the Bordeaux had stopped pretending to look at anything other than what was happening in front of them. The woman with the cashmere wrap had not moved from her love seat. She was looking at her wineglass. She had not looked up in several minutes. Whatever she was thinking, she was keeping it to herself, which was, as Ruth could have told her, exactly the problem. Joe picked up the 1987 deed from the desk, folded it, returned it to his pocket. He took Ruth's hand. He looked at Brandon one final time, not with triumph, not with contempt, but with the level, clear-eyed attention of a man who wants to be sure he is fully seen before he turns away. The lease on this property, Joe said quietly, is a matter of record. So is the preservation clause attached to the 1994 sale. I'd recommend your ownership group speak with their attorneys before the week is out. He said nothing else. He and Ruth turned toward the elevator. Patricia fell into step beside them. The lobby watched them go. The jazz standard did not resume. Iris Chen filed her first piece at 11:47 that night. She wrote it from the hotel restaurant, at the same table where she had sat down 3 hours earlier, expecting a quiet dinner and a chapter of the novel she kept in her bag for nights like this. The novel stayed in her bag. She wrote for 90 minutes without stopping the way she wrote, when the story was already complete, and her only task was to get out of its way. The headline read, "Caldwell Grand Manager Turns Away Founder's Family During Flood Warning, Then the Mayor Arrived." It ran in the Harlan Falls Courier online edition at midnight. By 2 a.m., it had been shared 400 times. By 5 a.m., 6,000. By the time the breakfast shift arrived at the Caldwell Grand the following morning, the story had been picked up by the Nashville Tennessean, the Chattanooga Times Free Press, and a wire service that distributed it to 47 regional papers across the Southeast. The video hit at 6:12 a.m. It had been shot by the woman at table 4, the one who had shown her husband the Bloomberg profile on her phone. She had started recording on her phone when Dale Whitfield crossed the lobby, and she had kept recording held low against the side of her chair, through the mayor's entrance, through Joe's speech at the desk, through Ruth's single sentence about the notebook. The angle was imperfect. The audio was slightly muddy in places where the storm pressed against the windows. None of that mattered. The clip of Ruth saying 84 entries, and I am so tired of writing them, ran for 41 seconds. It was shared 2 million times before noon. By that evening, it had crossed 11 platforms. Someone set it to silence, no music, no overlay, just Ruth's voice and the sound of rain against glass. That version spread further than any other. Comment sections erupted. The discourse was immediate and layered and loud, and it touched something people recognized from their own lives, from their own notebooks, from their own driveways, where they had sat for 10 minutes before they could go inside. She said 84 entries like it was a sentence she had been waiting years to finish. The way she said, "I am so tired." Not angry, just tired. That broke me. Every black woman I know has that notebook. Some of them just keep it in their heads. Brandon Mercer was terminated by phone at 7:45 that morning. The ownership group, a hospitality investment firm based in Atlanta, issued a public statement by 9. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed regret. The second described their commitment to inclusive hospitality. The third announced a donation to a local diversity initiative. It had the texture of a document written by attorneys who understood liability better than accountability. Joe's office did not respond to the statement. Destiny had not gone home after her shift ended. She had sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then come back inside and asked the night manager if she could speak with someone from ownership. She was told ownership was unavailable. She drove home. At 8 a.m., she sat at her kitchen table and recorded a 4-minute video on her phone. No script, no filter. Just Destiny Hooks, 24 years old, looking directly at the camera. She talked about the availability screen, the 14 open rooms, the 3 junior suites, the corner king on the 4th floor that had been empty for 4 days. She talked about the redirect to Route 9 and what Route 9 looked like in a flood warning. She talked about the phone call, "Use your judgment," and what those 3 words had meant as permission. She talked about the 11 months she had spent watching the redirect system operate and telling herself that staying quiet was just survival. "I had 14 rooms available," she said. 14. And I stood there and said nothing. That is on me. I have to live with that. The video was posted at 8:43 a.m. It received 9 million views in 48 hours. 3 former employees of the Caldwell Grand contacted Iris Chen by the end of the day. 2 current employees contacted her the day after. Each one confirmed the pattern. Code language, selective upgrades, reservations that disappeared for certain guests and reappeared for others. The unspoken calculus of who deserved the corner suite and who deserved Route 9. It was not written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It lived in the nods and the glances and the 2 words that came through a phone line and functioned as a system. Use your judgment. The ownership group's business partners began their own calculations. A corporate conference organizer canceled a $40,000 event contract on Wednesday. A regional wine distributor suspended their supply agreement on Thursday, pending review. The Southern Traveler magazine, which had featured the Caldwell Grand in its annual recommended properties list for 6 consecutive years, quietly removed the listing from its website without issuing a statement. Removing the listing without a statement was in its own way a statement. Joe's attorneys sent a single letter on Friday morning. Certified mail, 2 pages, precise and formal and unhurried. It outlined the preservation clause from the 1994 sale agreement, the one Joe had approved 30 years ago, without much deliberation, and had not thought about since. The clause required the ownership group to maintain specific historic preservation standards and community access provisions as a condition of holding the property. An audit of compliance over the past decade revealed 4 areas of material deficiency. The letter requested a response within 30 days. The ownership group called Caldwell Property Group 17 times between Friday and the following Wednesday. Joe's assistant took careful, detailed messages. Joe returned none of the calls. He and Ruth had driven to Nashville the morning after the incident. Imani had graduated at 2 p.m. under a sky that had cleared completely after the storm, the kind of Tennessee blue that only arrives after a hard rain. Joe had worn his blazer. Ruth had pressed it that morning without saying anything about it. Imani had found them in the crowd afterward and held on for a long time. On the drive back to Atlanta, Ruth opened her notebook to entry 84. Read it, closed it, put it in her bag. She did not open it again for a very long time. The mahogany front desk came out first. That was Destiny's idea. She had mentioned it offhandedly in a conversation with Joe's project manager 6 weeks after the incident, during the early planning meetings for the renovation. She said it quietly, almost as a question, would it be possible? And the project manager had written it down and brought it to Joe, and Joe had said yes, without deliberating. On the morning the renovation crew arrived, Destiny was standing on the sidewalk in front of the Caldwell Grand when they carried it out. It took 4 men. The desk was heavier than it looked, solid mahogany original to the 1920s building, built to last and built to impose. They loaded it onto a flatbed truck headed for an architectural salvage company in East Nashville. Destiny watched it go. Her arms were crossed. Her face was still. She stood there until the truck turned the corner and disappeared, and then she went inside and got to work. The renovation took 5 months. The ownership group, facing the weight of the Preservation Clause audit and the sustained pressure of public attention that had not dissipated the way they had hoped, agreed to a full renegotiation of the property agreement. The terms included a mandatory community access program, a transparent hiring initiative for hospitality staff from underserved zip codes, and the establishment of the Caldwell Hospitality Fellowship, a full scholarship program funded jointly by Caldwell Property Group, and the restructured ownership agreement training young people from low-income backgrounds for careers in hotel management. Destiny Hooks was the first recipient. She deferred her start date by 2 weeks because she had something to finish first. She sat down with Iris Chen for a 3-hour recorded interview that became the centerpiece of a long-form piece in the Tennessean, not about the incident itself, but about the systems that make incidents possible. The redirect protocols, the code language, the 3-word permissions that travel through phone lines and become policy without ever being written down. The piece ran at 4,000 words and was republished in 7 outlets. It was nominated for a state journalism award. Iris kept Destiny's name in every version. The brass plaque was installed on a Wednesday in February on the wall inside the main entrance at eye level, where no one could walk past it without seeing it. James Caldwell Porter, 1942 to 1964. He carried this building. Now it carries his name forward. Joe stood in front of it for a long time the morning it went up. Ruth stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. There are moments that have no adequate language and require only presence, and this was one of them. Mayor Patricia Okafor spoke at the dedication ceremony the following Saturday. She talked about what a name means when it is placed above a door, who it invites in, who it tells to use the service entrance, who it promises a corner suite, and who it redirects to Route 9. She talked about the difference between a name as inheritance and a name as aspiration. She talked about James Caldwell, a man she had never met, carrying bags through a service door for 22 years, with the dignity of someone who understood that his worth was not determined by which door he was permitted to use. She did not mention Brandon Mercer. He had relocated by then, according to a single line in a follow-up piece in the Courier. No one had called. Joe spoke last. He was brief the way he was always brief when the occasion was large enough that brevity was its own kind of respect. My grandfather couldn't walk through the front door, he said. I walked through it last October and got turned away. But we came back. He looked out at the crowd gathered on the sidewalk and spilling into the street. We always come back. Ruth's answer when a journalist asked her the same question Joe had been asked, "What do you want people to take away from this?" was shorter still. "We didn't stop for the night to make a point," she said, "but we left one." 2 years after the dedication, the Caldwell Hospitality Fellowship had placed 63 graduates in positions across Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. 11 of them had been promoted to management within 18 months of placement. The program had expanded to include a partnership with 3 community colleges and a mentorship track co-designed by Patricia Okafor's office. Destiny graduated from the hospitality management program at the top of her cohort. She returned to Harlan Falls and was hired as assistant general manager of the Caldwell Grand's newly restructured operation. On her first day, she walked through the front entrance past the brass plaque, past the framed 1987 photograph of a young man in an ill-fitting suit, holding a key, the photograph that had always been there on the wall of the second-floor hallway, waiting for someone to look at it carefully. And she went to work. There was no podium at the new front desk. Just a clean counter open on both sides with 2 staff members who greeted every person who walked through the door by looking at them directly and asking how they could help. Joe and Ruth returned to Harlan Falls every October. Same corner room, same view of Main Street, same walk in the morning to the coffee shop 2 blocks down that Ruth had decided made the best biscuits in Tennessee, a claim Joe disputed every year, and then quietly agreed with on the drive home. On the 3rd anniversary of that October night, Joe sat in the lobby by the fireplace. The same chairs, the same fire, the same amber light, and a young woman from the fellowship program came and sat across from him and asked him what it felt like to walk back through that door. He thought about it for a moment. Like something my grandfather started, he said, that I finally got to finish. Life lesson. Dignity is not a reward for achievement. It is not something you earn by reaching a certain number or carrying a certain name. It belongs to every person who walks through a door, any door, simply because they are human. What happened in that lobby on a rainy October night was not remarkable because Joe Caldwell was a billionaire. It was remarkable because Ruth had 84 entries in that notebook, and somewhere out there someone else is on entry 40 or entry 12 or entry 1, writing it down in the dark, hoping someone is paying attention. We are paying attention. We always were. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a notebook you've kept, or a door that was closed before you reached it, or a moment when someone looked at you and decided who you were before you could speak, drop it in the comments. Every story matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you believe that dignity has no dress code and no net worth requirement, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, because the truth, once it gets loose, keeps moving.